The environment is being used for a power struggle. The environment is being used for centralized government. The environment is being used to make a one-world government.
Few Americans really understand how much of our land has been taken over.
They are looking after somebody else's welfare, not the welfare and the rights of the American people.
I think that there's a real question here about the sovereignty of the United States.
It permits, I should say, really, that U.S. troops may be deployed under UN command.
Well, what I now know is that just because you join the U.S. Army doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be fighting for the U.S.
And that means eternal resistance to this idea that we are somehow going to disappear in some new world order.
Eagle Forum presents a special report, Global Governance, the Quiet War Against American Independence.
When Bill Clinton delivered his acceptance speech at the 1992 Democratic National Convention, the only person he mentioned, other than his mother and grandfather, was his history professor at Georgetown University Foreign Service School.
As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship. And then, as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley.
Professor Quigley's 1,300-page book, entitled Tragedy and Hope, described the small elite, which he said actually runs the United States. Quigley labeled it the network and said it consists of men who are cosmopolitan and international, close to governments, equally devoted to secrecy and the secret use of financial influence in political life. Quigley wrote that this network always prefers big government, big federal spending, large foreign giveaways, and the stability of a planned society rather than the uncertainties of the free market. Professor Quigley taught his student from Hope, Arkansas, how to tap into the power centers of the network. When Bill Clinton became president, he surrounded himself with people who shared that vision.
When Bill Clinton took office in 1993, he appointed his Rhodes Scholar roommate as his personal foreign policy advisor. Strobe Talbott had spent 22 years as a writer for Time magazine, where his writings revealed his eagerness to get rid of patriotism, American sovereignty, and independence. In the July 20th, 1992 Time, Talbott wrote an article entitled The Birth of the Global Nation. He enthusiastically predicted that in the next century, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. In fact, wrote Talbott, national sovereignty wasn't such a great idea after all. Talbott bragged about how our national sovereignty and independence have already been diminished by the International Monetary Fund and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT agreements. He boasted that the internal affairs of a nation are no longer off limits to world government. For his article, Talbott received an award from the World Federalist Association, a group committed to world government, and a congratulatory letter from Bill Clinton. Later, President Clinton appointed Strobe Talbott to the number 2 post in the U.S. State Department.
Strobe Talbott and those who dream of putting the United States under a single global authority know that Americans will never vote for world government. So instead, they talk about global governance, a global village, a global neighborhood, a global economy, a global commons. That means the sea, the air, and outer space. They talk about reforming the United Nations and expanding NATO. The solution to the problems they raise is always more international agencies wielding more and more control over American land, private property, natural resources, economy, trade, military forces, and even our personal relationships. The global governance bureaucrats in the Clinton administration have a close working relationship with the bureaucrats in international organizations. Together, they use 2 principal techniques to increase the power of global organizations: treaties and international conferences.
November 20th, 1989. With much fanfare and plenty of pictures of children, national news media announced that the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
The United Nations agreed that all countries should make sure that the rights of children everywhere are protected.
A treaty to protect children? Not according to constitutional attorney Michael Farris.
If the UN Convention is ratified, parents can't spank their children. They can't take them to church without a supervisor from the UN looking over their shoulder, making sure that they like what's going on. They can't choose alternative forms of education, either within the public schools or home schools or private schools. They cannot make decisions that keep their children away from pornography or other kinds of illicit material because the child has freedom of access to information. They lose control of any decision-making that would go against the politically correct thinking of the day.
This treaty proclaims broad rights of children, which presumably can be asserted against their parents. Article 12 would give the child the right to express his own views freely in all matters. Article 13 gives the child the right to receive information through the media of the child's choice. And Article 31 gives children the right to rest and leisure. The Convention on the Rights of Children goes on to prescribe that the education of the child shall include support of the United Nations, global education, multiculturalism, feminism, and environmentalism. And who will decide whether parents are obeying the UN treaty? A United Nations committee created by Article 43.
We should not have people outside this country mandating how we'll educate our children, what we'll do for our kids, when we'll do it, or what they'll read, or what they'll be exposed to, and what parental control will be.
I don't really believe that our government should interfere substantially with child rearing. It would be wrong for states to tell parents what they could or what they should do with their children, or for the federal government. But when you take that beyond the state and the federal government to an international organization that would seek to tell you, for instance, that you couldn't take your child out of certain sex education classes in our schools, for example, I think a family ought to have a right to understand what values it supports in that arena and to protect the child in relation to those values.
But the United Nations does not agree. In 1995, at the UN compound in Geneva, Switzerland, UN officials chastised Great Britain for allowing parents the freedom to choose spanking as a means of discipline, and for allowing parents to withdraw their children from sex education classes in public schools.
We have to understand that a treaty in the United States is the highest law of the land, co-equal with the Constitution, co-equal with federal laws passed in accordance with the Constitution. I'm not so much worried about the World Court enforcing it against American citizens as I am the United States District Court for the District of Maryland or New Hampshire or Rhode Island enforcing this decision based upon the tribunal's decisions from Geneva as to what the treaty means. The Children's Defense Fund, for example, could bring a lawsuit against a Christian school or a homeschooling family or a group of families and say that your homeschooling, your Christian school approach violates the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it would be enforceable in American courts.
Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Bush refused to sign this treaty, but President Clinton supports it and had Madeleine Albright sign it. And now they are pushing for its ratification in the U.S. Senate. That is not the only United Nations treaty supported by the Clinton administration that is designed to control human behavior. President Jimmy Carter signed the United Nations Convention on Discrimination Against Women in 1980. Presidents Reagan and Bush refused to support it. But now Bill Clinton is pushing for ratification.
The women who are behind this treaty are women who are not interested, as any ordinary American would be, in marriage, love, children, having a family. Quite the opposite. They tend to be women who want marriage to go away, who promote homosexual rights, who promote abortion on demand, all of these things that are totally contrary to the wishes of the vast majority of American women and men.
Article 1 on the UN Treaty on Women would abolish discrimination against women in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. This treaty covers marriage, family, church practices, other religious customs and beliefs, and every other area where society might otherwise choose to respect those differences. In case of any doubt, Article 2 states that the treaty would even extend to what it calls customs and practices. Article 3 would require us to pass new federal laws in social, economic, and cultural fields. Article 16 levels a broadside attack on states' rights and would obligate the federal government to take over all family law, including marriage, divorce, child custody, and property. And who would decide if you and your family are abiding by this UN treaty? A United Nations committee set up by Article 17.
This treaty, like other feminist exercises, is full of deception, and it's a good illustration of how people who have a political agenda to gain power for themselves use words to persuade others to join them through deception. A good example is the word family. When you or I use the word family, we mean mom, dad, and the kids. We mean extended family, grandma, grandpa. When they mean family, they mean two guys who met each other in a bar on Saturday night and have decided to live together. They mean any collection of people who have a either permanent or temporary interest in one another. That is just not what the rest of us mean by family, yet feminists will constantly invoke the word family with their own meaning in mind, hoping that we'll be fooled.
For example, Article 5 would require us to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, and to assure that we are following UN dictates about family education. And Article 10 would even require the revision of all textbooks and teaching methods to adhere to UN definitions about family and feminism.
The people representing the family legitimately and so forth, they were not permitted even to participate. And all of these wild-eyed people who want the government to control families and everybody else, they were in charge.
Jesse Helms is chairman of the U.S. Senate subcommittee that oversees treaties. He opposes these UN treaties.
Well, of course, these treaties that emanate from the United Nations, they are looking after somebody else's welfare, not the welfare and the rights of the American people. And that's the reason I look askance at every one of them.
Meanwhile, the Clinton administration is pushing hard for another series of treaties that would give international organizations control over our national economy. The Chemical Weapons Treaty purports to ban chemical weapons, but many critics believe this will seriously damage U.S. national security.
There are parts of the treaty that seem to suggest that you cannot put intelligent limitations on the export of technology, that everyone who signs the treaty must trade freely in all of the technologies of chemical warfare. Well, of course, every other country in the world would love it if they could have immediate required access to American technology in this area. We probably have the most sophisticated such technology in the world. I don't want to export that technology. I don't want there to be a treaty out there that even hints or suggests that we have to. That's something over which we must exercise control, and we must make the judgments. We, meaning leaders whom we can hold responsible.
But the UN Chemical Weapons Treaty provides no such accountability. Though it would give both allies and enemies our most sophisticated technology, many dangerous countries, such as Libya, Syria, Iraq, and North Korea, have not signed the treaty. Other countries with significant chemical weapons arsenals, such as Iran and Russia, have indicated that they will not comply with the treaty. In spite of the potential damage to U.S. national security and the unverifiable and unenforceable nature of the treaty, the Clinton administration succeeded in getting the U.S. Senate to ratify the Chemical Weapons Treaty in 1997.
The Chemical Weapons Treaty, of course, doesn't do one thing to protect the American people against chemical warfare. Yet it has caused many people to have a false sense of security.
It's interesting. We have a new chemical weapons ban treaty for which the people that are most likely to threaten us are not a party to. It's not much of a treaty. What did we accomplish with it? We accomplished nothing other than limiting ourselves to have a weak negotiating position with those very adversaries that we face today.
Another dangerous UN treaty that would damage our national economy is the law of the sea. Nearly 3/4 of the world's surface is covered by water. American companies harvest minerals from the sea that are important to our industrial and military defense. In the late 70s, the Carter administration developed a treaty that would effectively give the United Nations decision-making authority over the world's vast ocean riches.
And we have succeeded in adopting a convention covering practically every aspect of the uses and resources of the sea.
But President Ronald Reagan opposed the treaty. Doug Bandel worked on the law of the sea during his administration.
It really did two things. The first is it established a principle of essentially socialism. It said that all the unclaimed resources on the seabed would be owned by, as they put it, the common heritage of mankind. What they meant, of course, was by the United Nations. And the ownership would be vested in governments around the world. And he saw that as utterly inconsistent with the principles of free enterprise. His second concern was the way the UN would implement that principle, which was essentially to create another United Nations called the International Seabed Authority. And that Seabed Authority would have under it, its own corporation, the enterprise, to go mine the seabed on behalf of the governments of the world. And this would run like the United Nations. It would have a council and an assembly and committees and a huge bureaucracy. It would be taking money from the West, the industrialized countries, and giving it to third world countries. So it would be part of this whole scheme of what was called the New International Economic Order, an attempt to take money from the West and hand it out to third world governments. Well, he saw this kind of a mechanism as being utterly inconsistent with American interest, and he was quite willing to stand up to the rest of the world and kill the treaty for that reason.
The Clinton administration has revived the Law of the Sea Treaty and is pushing for Senate ratification. If passed, this treaty would expand UN control of the world's economy and build on another highly controversial treaty, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, ratified by Congress in late 1994. The highly controversial GATT treaty locked the United States into the World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization is basically a UN of world trade, a Supreme Court of world trade, which will basically dictate to countries whether or not they're violating world trade rules. And world trade rules take supremacy over all internal laws of various nations. So what you got is sort of a global Supreme Court handing down orders to nations and states, and it's got the capacity to allow countries to fine one another. But the goal of this basically is to subordinate national decisions to global decisions, and all national decisions done in the national interest to the exigencies, if you will, of world trade. In other words, if your national decision interferes somehow with world trade, for example, if Americans have a Buy American policy, the World Trade Organization will come in and say, that violates global trade rules, you have to change your laws.
The World Trade Organization, headquartered in Geneva, sets, administers, and enforces global rules of trade. It includes a legislature, an executive branch, and a Supreme Court that decides trade disputes, whose rulings cannot be vetoed by any nation. Despite assurances from GATT proponents that passage of this treaty would not interfere with the sovereignty of the United States, in its very first case, it ruled against the United States.
The first country sued under the World Trade Organization was the United States of America. We were sued under it by the Venezuelans because we would not accept fuels that did not meet our clean air standard. Well, we worked long and hard to clean the air up in this country. We lost the suit in the World Trade Organization, and now a body of people in the World Trade Organization, most of them not our friends, most of them actually our enemies in terms of foreign policy, have now dictated that we'll import dirty fuel and burn dirty gasoline in California because we've signed a treaty, a GATT treaty.
And this is the great threat here. The World Trade Organization is one of about 4 or 5 organizations which I believe the proponents of the New World Order hope to create into a global world government.
The third type of treaty being pushed hard by the Clinton administration would give much control over U.S. land, energy, and private property to various agencies of global governance. In Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the United Nations hosted a conference called Earth Summit. This conference produced a new treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity. President Bush did not sign the treaty, but it was hailed by UN officials and various non-governmental groups, or NGOs.
We must eradicate poverty. We must achieve greater equality within and between nations.
we must reconcile human activities and human numbers with the laws of nature.
Fine-sounding rhetoric, but what did it mean, and how would it be implemented? When the treaty was up for ratification by the U.S. Senate, scientist and ecologist Dr. Michael Kaufman discovered the then-secret 1,000-page document written to implement the Biodiversity Treaty.
People need to understand that this innocent-looking 18-page document is a time bomb waiting to go off. The document calls for literally reducing the human population by as much as 2/3 to 3/4 in the next 30 to 50 years. It could set aside up to 1/2 of the American landscape into wilderness areas interconnected by wilderness corridors, all surrounded by human buffer zones in which human activities are highly regulated.
Dr. Kaufman's maps are based on United Nations documents. Red areas represent core reserves, land where little or no human activity would be allowed. Yellow areas represent human buffer zones, or areas where human activity would be highly regulated. Normal activity would be allowed only in the blue zones. And how does the UN plan to enforce this control?
By establishing a regulatory system that would literally control every process that we would have, whether or not we can develop an area, build a building, farm a tract of land, conduct forestry practices, grow beef on the rangelands, whatever. That is very, very clear in these United Nations documents that they want to set up a regulatory structure that would affect every man, woman, and child on planet Earth, and all of the control would be headquartered in the United Nations. And if we take the more recent United Nations documents, it's going to be called the Trusteeship Council in the restructure of the United Nations that's occurring right now.
In addition, UN biodiversity plans call for limits on human consumption, land use, transportation, energy, and population. In order to protect biodiversity, we would be required to get rid of fertilizers and cut food production in half, to drastically restrict our use of automobiles, fuel, refrigeration, air conditioning, and meat. Just 2 days before the U.S. Senate was scheduled to vote on the Biodiversity Treaty, this new information came into the hands of Jim Jatras and other members of the Republican Policy Committee.
The Biodiversity Convention was on a fast track to ratification. It looked like a sure deal. Only late in the process did it become apparent to us that the vagueness of the convention, things that would be ratified and defined after the fact, were really to be found in other documents, like the Global Biodiversity Assessment, the Wildlands Project, things that we'd never heard of in the official context of the documents we were provided. Through various channels, we were finally able to get a hold of these documents, bring them to the attention of the Senator's office, and assemble the 34 votes necessary to defeat this convention if it were to come to the floor.
The Biodiversity Treaty was not ratified by the U.S. Senate, but later President Clinton did sign it, and it is the favorite project of Al Gore, as set forth in his book, Earth in the Balance. Many of the treaty's policies are now being implemented through the State Department's Man and the Biosphere program and President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development.
And the Man and the Biosphere program, as revealed in the U.S. State Department documents as well as UNESCO documents, clearly show that the Man and the Biosphere program actually is the first step in implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there are 47 of these Man and the Biosphere programs around this nation that occupy about 51 million acres of U.S. soil. So it is very actively and aggressively being pursued by this current administration to implement the provisions of the Convention on Biological Diversity, even though it has not even been ratified.
Another treaty designed to grant control of American property to the United Nations was ratified by the U.S. Senate back in 1972. The World Heritage Convention conferred on the UN organization called UNESCO special powers to designate selected American treasures as World Heritage Sites and to develop regulations and policies concerning their use. Independence Hall and the Statue of Liberty have already been designated World Heritage Sites under UNESCO.
World Heritage Sites are many of our national parks. In fact, 68% of our national parks land base is now under UNESCO's World Heritage Site. And that includes the symbol of independence in America, the Independence Hall, the Statue of Liberty, Yellowstone National Park, Monticello, Carlsbad Caverns. My goodness, I could go on and on and on. There are 20 of these sites, and the American people didn't even realize this was happening. It was done in secret.
Yellowstone National Park is a World Heritage Site. In 1995, a mining company tried to buy land outside the park to develop a gold mining operation. However, President Clinton invoked the UN's World Heritage Site Treaty, deferring ultimate authority not to the Environmental Protection Agency, a U.S. agency, but to UNESCO, to which the United States doesn't even belong. UN officials declared the mine in violation of the UN treaty.
The environment is being used for a power struggle. The environment is being used for centralized government. The environment is being used to make a one-world government. And if you don't think this is not occurring, just see what's happening in the United States.
Congressman Don Young represents a growing number of Americans concerned about United Nations takeover of American land and property. He introduced the American Sovereignty Protection Act to restore authority for decisions about U.S. lands and property to the American government.
This is an awakening call that we are facing a battle against those that want to destroy a great United States of America.
Few Americans really understand how much of our land has been taken over by the UN or UNESCO.
All these treaties are dangerous attacks on American freedoms, national security, land ownership, and private property. Every one of these treaties involves setting up a new global bureaucracy that would have some kind of obnoxious control over American citizens, or our families, or our schools, or our businesses, or our use of natural resources and energy, or our land. And together they add up to what is meant by global governance. Treaties are one road to global governance. United Nations conferences are another. These global conferences pretend to be democratic conventions of representatives of more than 100 nations who come together to vote for plans they all agree on. Nothing could be further from the truth. The policies are all written ahead of time, and the so-called delegates are manipulated to produce what is called consensus. The consensus is never submitted to Congress, but the Clinton administration goes right ahead and carries out these policies anyway.
The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio was portrayed by the media as a place where world leaders came together to decide how to govern the Earth's environment. What really happened was that consensus was produced by aggressive lobbying by environmental groups that had gotten semi-official recognition as non-governmental organizations called NGOs. Canadian journalist Elaine Dewar attended the Rio Earth Summit.
There was a charity set up in the United States called Echo Fund 92, which had a purpose to help Mr. Strong in the operations of his office as Secretary General of the conference. And most of the money that flowed into that charity came from very large organizations, for example, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, some very large industrial interests in Japan, in Italy, etc. That money, as I understand it from their reports to the IRS, was used effectively to fund NGOs which were in attendance, which were basically allowed to come as representatives of the people to both the Rio PrepCon and the summit itself. In other words, groups were created out of whole cloth and attended at the Rio summit as if they were representing people, and they were not.
The people from other countries who go to these international conferences seem to be envious of America's high standard of living and private property. In 1996, at the UN Habitat Conference in Istanbul, Turkey, the consensus decided that the United States should provide housing for people all over the world. And at the UN World Hunger Conference in Rome, the consensus decided that America should take on the task of feeding the whole world. Now, President Clinton is planning on going to a world conference in Kyoto, Japan. It is widely predicted that the consensus in Kyoto will bind us to reduce U.S. energy consumption by 1/4, and that would have a devastating effect on America's standard of living and on the ability of U.S. wage earners to support their families.
Senator Chuck Hagel co-sponsored a Senate resolution denouncing Clinton administration plans to sign the controversial global warming treaty. His resolution gained near unanimous support.
There are essentially 5 major problems with the global warming treaty as it is now being conceived and probably presented. One, there's no clear, concise science that shows that the globe is warming up. At best, the science is contradictory, it's inconclusive, it's unclear. Second, the economic consequences. The economic consequences, we know for sure, would be disastrous, would be devastating to this country, driving industries out of this country. We would lose millions of jobs. Energy costs would go up. Productivity would go down. Standard of living would go down. Third, if in fact you want to curb greenhouse gas emissions, you certainly don't do that by binding the developed nations and let all the other countries, 130 of the so-called non-developed countries, including China, India, Mexico, South Korea, and others, off, because they will be, within 10 to 15 years, the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. Fourth, national sovereignty. This cuts right at the heart of national sovereignty of the United States of America. We, in essence, if we signed this treaty, would be saying we would allow an international body to come in and dictate to our industries, our businesses, our people, what they could do and what they couldn't do. Use of what energy, which sources of energy, the cost of energy. And fifth, national security implications. If this treaty was signed, it would have disastrous implications on our national security. It would mean that we would have to fly less. We would shut down many of our training programs for tanks, armored vehicles, for ships, and for what? To sign this treaty.
But the Global Warming Conference in Kyoto, Japan, is only the latest in a long line of United Nations conferences. In September 1995, the United Nations Conference on Women gathered in Beijing, China. Kathy Adams attended.
In Beijing, the agenda was very radical feminism. It was homosexual rights. It was abortion on demand.
News reports from Beijing showed women from many different countries singing and holding hands. Viewers were led to believe that these women came together to represent their countries on women's issues. According to Washington Times correspondent George Archibald, that was not the case.
So a lot of these people who participated are already beneficiaries of UN programs, and many of them are getting grants through the United Nations. So they're basically paid functionaries, grant recipients of the UN. So then the UN staff can basically tell these people what they want them to do. And if they don't do what they want them to do, you know, the implicit point is that it's going to affect their funding. When they were promoting the idea that the definition of family should include same-sex partners, men and men, women and women, and a delegate from Honduras and another from Guatemala vigorously objected to this, along with the Vatican. Now, they were taken aside and told, your aid, your programs are going to, you're threatening the funding for your programs if you continue to take this position.
The consensus process was so firmly planted before the meeting even began that the opening day of the conference there was consensus formed. That tells me that the United Nations is not a place for open debate. It is not a place for people to share different ideas and for freedom to reign. It is a place instead where the United Nations has an agenda, and they have set the agenda beforehand, and people come to the table in order to find out what their working orders, what their marching orders are, and then they are to go back home and implement what the UN's agenda is.
Who directed the consensus on women's and family issues?
I mean, I shot this picture of Bella Abzug as she came to the opening ceremony in Beijing. My own description of her is that she was the Empress of Beijing. In the New York preparatory conferences prior to the conference in China, she was very visible on the floor of the General Assembly when they had the prep meetings, orchestrating action on the the various sections of the draft agenda that was going to be considered in Beijing. I mean, she had privileged access. Regular run-of-the-mill private citizen Americans could never have gotten access that Bella Abzug had. And she was like a symphony conductor, just orchestrating the whole thing.
All the UN bureaucrats not only know Bella Abzug, but they defer to her, they speak of her with respect, they recognize her when she's in the audience, and they invite her to be involved in their meetings and conferences. Bella Abzug is one of the driving intellectual forces in shaping the UN agenda. And of course, her agenda is always what it has been. She was frank enough about it when she was in Congress. She is in favor of destroying the foundations of American society and family life, and destroying the foundations of the American economy, and replacing it with socialism.
When the American delegation returned to the United States, Madeleine Albright announced that Beijing had produced an international women's movement of activists, advocates, and advisors to the nations of the world. The Clinton administration set up the President's Interagency Council on Women, a federal entity composed of high-level representatives from 30 federal agencies, whose mission is to implement the commitments under a document called Bring Beijing Home. Bella Abzug boasts that work is underway to promote her platform in high schools, colleges, and universities. And Congress and the American people never had the chance to vote on any part of it.
The most revealing thing about the 3 UN conferences that I have attended is that they have a very set agenda. The United Nations is trying to impose its ideas on the rest of the world. But how are they going to pay for it? I attended a press conference by the World Bank when I was in Rome, and it was very clear that they plan to implement many of the ideas coming to consensus at these different conferences. And who is the biggest funder of the World Bank? The United States is.
The global conference that had the least media coverage in the United States was the UN World Summit for Social Development held in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1995. That's where UN officials worked for consensus on a really extraordinary plan to finance their goals for global governance.
At Copenhagen, James Gustav Speth, a Clinton-appointed UN official, called for a global tax on foreign exchange transactions. This plan would give the UN a steady flow of trillions of U.S. dollars without any action by Congress. Michael Schwartz attended the Copenhagen conference.
What he proposed is a tax on international currency transfers and a tax on international travel, which would be collected by the central banks that did the international currency transfers. So nobody would notice that they were being taxed. But in fact, given especially the high level of international trade that exists today and the high level of international travel, it was estimated at Copenhagen that this would bring in $1.5 trillion a year to the United Nations.
The move to give the United Nations power to impose taxes has the support of several wealthy liberal foundations, such as the MacArthur and Carnegie Foundations. The World Federalist Association, headed by former presidential candidate John B. Anderson, has called for UN taxes on international travel and postal service. Of course, U.S. taxpayers are already paying more than 1/4 of the UN budget.
You get an organization which literally spends hundreds of millions of dollars on conferences every year, on travel, on publications. I mean, this is an organization that puts out like 160 million publications a year and 2 billion pages. Well, what we have is utter irresponsibility there. And as long as you have a system where a voting majority, I mean, 1% of the money comes from the voting majority, you're not going to have a responsible system.
We're now paying 25% of routine UN activities, 31.2% or something like that of UN peacekeeping activities. I think that most of our constituents believe that we are assessed far more than our fair share of UN routine activities and UN peacekeeping.
Right now, the UN exists only because sovereign governments who are accountable to their people in some way contribute money and are willing to go along with what the UN does. And possibly some countries could say, no, we're not going to do that, and they'd get away with it today. But if the UN were able to raise its own money, raise its own revenues, nobody could stand up against their will. They'd have the power to enforce their will even against a sovereign nation, even against the United States.
The Clinton administration is moving rapidly to transform all these treaties and conferences into U.S. policies, even when we haven't ratified the treaties and haven't agreed to the so-called consensus produced by the UN conferences. The Clinton administration is moving very fast to transfer control over American lands, rivers, resources, private property, and precious heritage sites to the United Nations. And on top of all that, the Clinton administration is determined to put American servicemen and women under foreign command, where instead of defending American national interests, they will be used to fight never-ending UN and NATO wars.
San Francisco, 1945. International leaders gather from all over the world to meet for the first United Nations conference. The organizing Secretary General for the San Francisco Conference was Alger Hiss, who was later exposed as a Soviet spy. High hopes for the United Nations in the 1940s gave way to disillusionment in the 1950s, when the UN police action in Korea taught us the tragic meaning of the phrase, no-win war. By the 1970s, the UN had become a forum for a steady stream of speeches attacking the United States. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, the anti-American agenda of the UN was finally challenged, and the United Nations lost most of its influence.
Reagan saw the UN really as acting very much against American interests. That it was being used by the Soviet Union, it was being used by a very radical third world majority that called itself the Group of 77. So he felt that the UN had to be dealt with very strongly. That's why he appointed Jeane Kirkpatrick, for example, somebody who, in his view, would go to the United Nations and take down that kick me sign off the United States. That would say, we're going to stand up for American interests, and that means opposing the UN when we need to. It means vetoing things when we need to. It means walking out of conferences when we need to. It means defunding organizations when we need to, UNESCO, for example. So he took a very tough stand. I mean, he was willing to have the United States participate, but his view was, we've got to transform the way we're there.
But then President George Bush revived it in order to make it a sponsor of his Persian Gulf War. Bush introduced a new phrase to the American public.
Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. Now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order.
President Bill Clinton was glad to define this new world order by demanding ratification of all the UN treaties that Presidents Reagan and Bush had rejected. The Clinton administration is pushing hard for the biodiversity and climate change treaties, for the Law of the Sea Treaty, and for the UN Treaty on Women, and for the UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child. And the global governance advocates of the Clinton administration are also demanding a new and controversial role for America's armed services.
Somehow I don't feel that President Clinton distinguishes in quite the same way that President Reagan did between the United States and the United Nations. I think President Reagan had a very strong sense of American identity and of American citizenship. And I think he was very deeply attached to the American tradition and to American men and women, but to American freedom and to American forces. And I feel really that President Clinton is much more likely to be speaking about the world. Now, I'm in favor of, the world, too, and I think President Reagan was. But I don't think President Reagan wanted to risk other people's lives. He didn't want to risk American servicemen's lives in, UN berets for causes that had only an ambiguous or remote relationship to American interests.
In May of 1994, Bill Clinton signed Presidential Decision Directive 25. This changed the mission and purpose of America's armed forces.
PDD 25 authorizes the President to deploy U.S. forces into conflict without the consent of the Congress. That bothers me a lot because our Constitution requires that a declaration of war requires the consent of the Congress. Two, I'm bothered by the fact that it permits, I should say, really, that U.S. troops may be deployed under UN command. What makes UN command so very dangerous is that it would put U.S. forces under commanders and with other groups with whom they, are not familiar, with whom they have never exercised, whose language they do not speak, and who do not know them and don't know what they can do and what they can't do. So I think that the capacity for damage and the danger
is really magnified under any kind of operation that takes place under UN command.
Witness Somalia. Under PDD-25, American troops were sent into that country's civil war under foreign command as so-called UN peacekeepers. American forces were ambushed, leaving 18 American soldiers killed, plus 54 wounded. On television that evening, Americans saw Somalians dancing on jeeps and dragging a dead American serviceman through the streets.
Our Rangers should not have been in the streets of Mogadishu unless we had complete operational control.
U.S. forces were not sufficiently heavily armed. They had asked for, their commanders, their American commanders, had asked for heavier armor and heavier weapons, and they had been turned down under the peacekeeping policies that were formulated by the same people that formulated PDD-25.
Parents of two of the slain American soldiers spoke to a Senate subcommittee.
I told the president today that Casey did die in vain.
My son's death served no purpose. His courage and sacrifice have been wasted.
When Al Gore, our vice president, tells the parents of the young men who were shot down in that friendly fire helicopter accident over Iraq, you should be proud of your son who died as a UN soldier. That was a wake-up call to a lot of Americans.
As a congresswoman, it bothers me because most young men and women who sign up for service in the United States Armed Forces pledge to give their all, their life, their liberty, their pursuit of happiness. They lay everything they have on the line to serve America. But most young men and women wouldn't lay everything they have on the line to serve another nation.
Army Specialist Michael New is a decorated American soldier with an exemplary record of service. On October 2, 1995, Michael New's Army commanders informed him that he would soon be ordered to Macedonia as part of a UN peacekeeping operation. But unlike previous U.S. involvement in UN exercises, this mission would be different.
When we fought in Korea, we fought there as U.S. soldiers, side by side with soldiers from other countries, in pursuit of a UN goal, with the understanding that we also had a vital national interest that was being pursued there. When our soldiers go to Macedonia, they go there in effect as UN soldiers. They wear the UN insignia. They give up their Department of Defense, their DOD identification card.
This is the first time in history where we've had all the combination of factors of UN foreign commanders, UN uniforms, and clear direction to stop being exclusively a United States soldier. Taking the UN identity card, for example, into Macedonia was one of the requirements.
When the order first came down, I was stunned. I was shocked. It just struck me as wrong. How could they do that to me? How could they ask me to swear an oath of loyalty to America and then expect me to turn around and forget about that oath by putting on someone else's uniform?
Michael New decided to approach his commanding officer.
I went to my commander, and I told my commander, very simply, I took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. My Army enlistment oath is to the Constitution, and in that oath I cannot find any reference to the United Nations.
Specialist New was court-martialed for refusing to wear the UN uniform.
Michael New's case is the first time where there's a real test of the sovereignty of the United States of America in a way that positions the Constitution against internationalist thinking. And the question is, does the United States government have to obey the laws of the United States in the area of deploying our troops? And I think it's a very important question that we answer.
Well, what I now know is that just because you join the U.S. Army doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be fighting for the U.S.
What troubles me about this is that there is a general tendency, I think, on the part of our leadership, and it isn't, again, just this administration, although it's reached kind of a crescendo in this administration, that we need to submerge the goals and the sovereignty of the United States to the goals and the sovereignty of the United Nations. I think that there's a real question here about the sovereignty of the United States.
The Michael New case exposed the plan to transform American troops into a United Nations army. And the American people are simply not going to put up with that. So now the advocates of global governance have come up with a new plan. A treaty to expand NATO will soon be submitted to the U.S. Senate. If it is ratified, it means that American sons and daughters will be obliged to defend the current borders of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Slovenia, and all the other countries that join NATO in the future. Those countries have been fighting over their borders for thousands of years, and we would be obligated to send U.S. troops to fight one Bosnia after another.
NATO expansion might not be the worst U.S. foreign policy initiative of the 20th century, but it definitely ranks in the top 3 or 4.
Ted Galen Carpenter is a vice president for foreign policy at Washington's Cato Institute and has written extensively about NATO policy.
It would antagonize Russia, possibly leading to a Russian-Chinese alliance. It would undermine pro-Western Russian Democrats. It would create security commitments that we could not fulfill to the new East European members of NATO without a U.S. nuclear guarantee, and it would entangle us in any number of potential Bosnia-style crises in Central and Eastern Europe. It is a dreadful, potentially catastrophic idea.
The advocates of global governance are all around us. Public school textbooks are filled with concepts about world citizenship rather than American independence, about protection of the earth and biodiversity rather than human rights, and about definitions of the family to conform to the feminist consensus in Beijing and the UN treaties about women and the child. The National Education Association passes a resolution every year calling for global education in the schools. I received this letter from Walter Cronkite, the longtime icon of television news, asking me to contribute to the campaign for global change. He urged a global call for a reinvigorated United Nations, permanent UN peacekeeping forces, an international court, and a strong commission for sustainable development that would restrict our private property rights. Global treaties and conferences are a direct threat to every American citizen. They are an assault on your right to raise and educate your children as you see fit. They are an attack on your ownership of your private property and on American ownership of our national treasures, such as our national parks. They are an attack on your pocketbook, because if the UN ever gets taxing power, there's no limit to how much of our money it can grab. And they are an attack on the American standard of living, because their goal is to steal American wealth and redistribute it to the rest of the world. Global treaties and conferences are an assault on the soul and the sovereignty of America, because they mean that young American men and women will be sent around the world on phony peacekeeping expeditions. Our Declaration of Independence and United States Constitution are the fountainhead of the freedom and prosperity Americans enjoy. That freedom is threatened now. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It's time for Americans to be vigilant so that treaties and conferences do not steal our precious and unique heritage. That's why we produce this program, so that you and other Americans will know the truth, and together we will resist global governance. Watch for treaty votes in the U.S. Senate. Make your voice heard when it counts, and show this program to your friends. Truth is the best weapon against global governance.
What I'm seeing is an escalation of the takeover of command and control of our military, the takeover of a large portion of our land base, and the conquering of America's freedom and spirit of independence and self-reliance.
Whether we move left or right or center, the destiny of our country ought to be determined by Americans. And to see our own leaders surrendering that sovereignty to global institutions, it seems to me really approaches a sellout and a betrayal of the founding fathers and of the idea for which America was founded.
I simply reject the notion that somehow we can go to countries where there is less freedom, less respect, less dignity for any affected population, whether it be women or children, and get them to tell us what we ought to be doing. I think as responsible individuals, given the capacity to make consequential choices by our government and ultimately by God who created us to be free, we don't need an international organization to tell us how to treat our children, how to treat ourselves, how to treat our women, how to fashion our families. As free Americans, we can make those decisions right here at home.